Hello, my wonderful viewers, and welcome to another episode of Betty Adams Overanalyzes. Today we are going to talk about that Yoked R2 unit and my incredible disappointment in the absolute lack of a classical education in my fellow YouTubers. Now, to anybody who's still making their YouTube videos on this episode of The Mandalorian, feel free to ignore that, but seriously, I'm disappointed, people. Alright, no, let's move on. So, let's talk about that wonderful leggy R2 unit that was the controller of the travel device that is called very specifically on screen with clearly audible sound called the ferry. Plot twist! That was not actually a ferry. That was a barge. The difference? A ferry carries you cross-stream. It carries you from point A to point B, be it a lake, a river. A ferry goes back and forth between 2 points, usually crossing the flow of the stream. They're very specifically built like this. Usually they have powerful engines or a cable that they can grip onto to move you directly across the river. Before they had the engines and the cable, you'd have a strong ferryman and a rower to row you across. But anyway, a ferry goes from point A to point B. They're usually more square or more round, while a barge carries you downstream and upstream. It's going to be longer. It's still going to be a rectangle, but it's going to be a long, skinny rectangle, just like the one we saw on the show, because it's meant to flow with the current. The ferry, when hit by a current, is supposed to move as slowly as possible because it does not want to flow with the current. The barge is very specifically meant to flow with the current with the least possible effort by the bargeman. Trust me on this, my grandpa was a ferryman. He worked the Buena Vista Ferry for 18 years. I know my ferries, and I know my barges. I've lived on rivers. That boat was meant to carry folks, most likely smugglers, but probably even maintenance personnel for the sewers, up and down that stream. It is a flat bottom and a blunt nose and was obviously used to carry cargo in a smooth flow, but it was not a ferry. So, why did the voice of accurate exposition, Grief Karga himself, call it a ferry? I strongly suspect it is because the writers and I shared a very disheartening experience. Looking at you, fellow YouTubers. Anyway, story time number 1. There's going to be a few of those in this episode, so I'm labeling them. Opening Pandora's box and finding it empty. It is a cool autumn night, and university-aged me has eagerly signed up for my very first night class. As most of my hard science, math, and requirement courses are all solidly over long before the sun goes down, this was a giddy new experience for me. This was also my first non-science 400 level class, writing fiction. I arrived and soon made friends with the rest of the science majors. Most of us had chosen this class because it didn't interfere with our schedules, and its 400 level meant it met a massive chunk of our humanities credit requirements. That was 3 classes that we didn't want, that we didn't have to take. So we settled into our corner and happily offered technical and scientific observations on human nature, ballistics, and biology during class discussion. Now, there were about 30 people in the class total, and I soon became uncomfortably aware that out of those only one other was writing science fiction, and he was going into screenwriting, so our styles had very little in common. I shrugged that off. I had other nerdy interests that I could share with these people. But then came the small groups. We broke into groups of 5, and would each write a story and then critique each other's fiction. The other sci-fi guy wasn't there with me, but my small group did like my stuff even if they weren't into science fiction, and I considered that a high compliment. I remember one night clearly. We were in a seldom-used hall that had comfy chairs. It was like our own little personal corner. It was time to review a piece set a bit prior to the Middle Ages. It was by far my favorite out of everything I had read in class so far. The technique was okay, but the story itself was brilliant. The deeply oversimplified version is that an abbot in a monastery, which if you remember were the centers of learning and science at the time, accept a mysterious box as an offering from a penitent woman who turns out to be the Pandora, and the box is the Pandora's box. The final line that she says here is that there's still hope in the box. I thought it was a brilliant way to show how the mythos of the Western world turned from placing its hope in the myths of the past and started finding cures to the ills of the world, its hope in science. I was eager to discuss this in our group, but when the time came, the author and I could tell that no one else got the story at all. They were all confused by it, didn't understand it. We glanced at each other uneasily, and the author rubbed her head awkwardly and said she probably hadn't made it clear that the woman was Pandora, and she could probably work a few more obvious clues into the story. I frowned. It was pretty clear to me from the midpoint of the story who she was, but then one of the other classmates spoke up. "Who's Pandora?" The author and I gaped at them in shock. This was a 400-level writing course in the 3rd year of one of the best universities in the world. How did 3 out of 5 students not know who Pandora was? This, my friends, is a very human reaction, to assume that what is common knowledge to you is common knowledge to everyone. A very human misconception. Your experience is unique. Always remember that. But still, in this particular situation, I think we were somewhat justified. This story, this mythos, was taught long before the age of high school to students from Moscow to London for over 1,000 years. It was considered one of the core subjects needed to move on to the academy. We were shocked, and the rest of the class agreed that the story made much more sense in the light of this proto-woman figure, but they genuinely had no idea who Pandora was. Learning that not everyone has access to the knowledge that you consider basic, and learning exactly how to tell good stories anyway to connect with people, is one of those things that require a lifetime of mastery, and I've been working on it for nearly 2 decades now. So I think it's safe to say that it's been years since I had a shock like that. But I think the Mandalorian writers have had that same shock, and it stuck with them just as strongly as it stuck with me. And the Mandalorian had to rip off that band-aid that I'd built over that through practice with redemption. This episode, it is drenched in the very same symbolism that my ethereal classmate had called upon to craft her clever little story. And it feels like no one else is talking about it, like we have forgotten the spirit of our father, like we now have to travel down into the underworld to resurrect the spirit of our fathers, and sweet crap dragons, this show works on so many meta levels. Anyway, going back to that Yoked R2 unit that piloted the barge that was called the ferry. Why was it called a ferry, and why did the droid have long skeletal arms and legs? Remember that, skeletal arms and legs. It's important. First, the ferry barge. The physics of the situation needed a barge. Both boat types are basically boxes. The main difference is that the ferry is meant to cross the current and is a square box and to be under constant direction because of that. Ferries have strong engines or a cable to guide them from one side to the other. Barges are built to be carried down or upstream with the smallest possible effort and control. So it made sense for the boat that carried them down the lava stream to be barge-shaped. But it was important for it to be a ferry. Therefore, Grief Karga says, ferry, in show. But, from the symbology side that this is the River Styx, the River of Death, the Yoked droid, he is Charon, the ferryman of the River Styx. Of course he is going to have long skeletal limbs. Of course his craft must be called a ferry. Of course he took his price in precious metal. Of course there was no stopping that ride. Just as I discussed the armor in the previous video as more of a part of the world than a character in the world, the ferry droid Charon is even more so a natural force. He is a link from the lava fields of Navarro to our own ancient past. His barge is called a ferry because the writers want to whisper to the deep, dark corners of your mind where every story you've ever forgotten lives. This fragment of an episode, from the moment they find the pile of armor to the moment that they burst back into the sun, there was a story being told, a very, very old story. You may have heard me mention the Epic of Gilgamesh before. This is how old that story is. The Epic of Gilgamesh is considered the first story to be written down. Okay, so let us tell an old story. Story time number 2. I don't know where I heard it first. It was, of course, told to me by my parents, the way all these legends are. They considered it important that I have a real connection to the culture of all my genetic ancestors. According to the internet, the story comes from the middle place of the Zuni tribe, modern-day Arizona, New Mexico, but the version I was told involved building a lodge each night as the man trekked across from his forest home far east into the Far East. And the Zuni were a Pueblo tribe. They didn't really build lodges, didn't really live in forests, and as far as I know, all of my ancestors were forest-dwelling folk. But who knows how the story traveled in the days before the printing presses. It might have traveled east across the continent to where my ancestors lived long ago, and they brought it back west with them. But anyway, moving on. This is the story I heard. There once was a young man who loved his wife deeply, but she grew ill and died. He could not stand to live without her, so he traveled far to the west to the world of the dead. It was a long journey, and each night he built a lodge to sleep in. He reached the underworld, following the red feather that his wife had tied in her hair so that he could follow her. The rulers of the spirit world had compassion on him. They were impressed by his deep love and selflessness, and granted him permission to take his wife back to the world of the living. But they warned him that it takes time for a body to regenerate, and he must not touch her until they were safely home. Each day they traveled, and each night they rested in the lodges he had built. Each night her body regenerates, and he can see her more clearly. And on the final night, she looks so solid, so real, that he can stand it no longer, and he leaps over the fire to take her in his arms. She immediately fades to nothing. Not only can he never see her again, no human would ever be able to bring a loved one back from the underworld again. Sound familiar? I thought so too when I heard the tale of Orpheus and his trip to the underworld. This is a near universal story that is older than writing itself. In the more Greek version, we get Charon the ferryman. He is usually portrayed as very tall with long skeletal limbs that he uses to pole the ferry across the River Styx. He is cloaked, covered in dark gray material. That droid was Charon. Wherever there is a culture that recorded its mythos, there is some variant of the story. In the time before ancient Babylon existed, Ishtar stormed into the underworld and challenged the queen of the underworld for her beloved, with mixed results in that story. But one of the most common variants, because every story this old has many variants, and one of the most common ones, one so common and so distinct that it earns its own place apart from the other variants, is the one where a son must journey to the underworld to rescue the spirit of his father. The first one was, unsurprisingly, the Epic of Gilgamesh. But here's how the story goes. The father grows old, he grows sick, his body fails and he dies, but he has something his son needs critically, so the son travels into the underworld and rescues him either literally or spiritually. The generic symbolism that is taught in this story is that every culture ossifies, grows old and fails. Babylon rose and fell, Rome rose and fell, the British Empire rose and fell. Every culture goes through this process. And this process is redone every generation. So every generation, every person has to go back and sort through the moldy old remnants of their father's culture, find out what is still good, and bring that back to life for the next generation. That's in short the generally considered symbolism. And this is very, very key to human psychology because it shows up so early and so often. An example, and again, these rescues can be literal or physical. Examples of the literal rescue, where in the story the son actually physically goes to the underworld and brings his father back, come from the Seneca tribe's tale of, please forgive my pronunciation, Hagoen and his 10 sons. In this case, one of the sons literally rescues Hagoen from the underworld in the form of the lodge of the giant spider. Then there's the everlasting death and rebirth of the Egyptian sun deity Ra. It's not so much one of his sons that rescues him, but there's a whole series of sub-deities that see him safely through the night of his death. And in modern day literature, we have Disney's tales of Pinocchio, Aladdin, and most recently The Princess and the Frog. Honestly, the mouse really loves this trope and does it again and again, and I am not surprised that we've seen it in the Disney version of Star Wars. Examples of the more spiritual rescue, where the son usually learns important life lessons that are the distilled wisdom or spirit of his father, include the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, of course, but the Aeneid was just a fan fiction ripoff of the Odyssey, for all that it's a classic in and of itself. And approximately half of all anime by weight, half of most apocalyptic science fiction, and of course Disney's own The Mandalorian. Let's talk about Mandalorians for a bit. Who is the Mandalorian father, this culture that has ossified and died in the relevance to this story? Genetic lineage means very little to them. The Mandalorians are a creed, not a race or a planet. In a very real sense, the only father a Mandalorian has is the creed itself. Mando and crew enter the underworld in search of his father and find his father dead, his bones scattered across the floor in the form of the armor. His mother tells him that the child is his, his father and the creed of his father, the Mandalorian, might have died at the Imperial hands in these sewers, in that underworld, but he can bring them back. He must cross the river of death and bring his father's spirit back to the light of the world of the living. This is actually another common motif for the son. Before he goes to rescue his father, he goes and communes with his mother for instructions. Now, Din Djarin meets the fairy droid Charon just as Orpheus did in the Greek version of this legend. When Din steps onto the ferry, the Mandalorian's father, the culture of the creed is dead. When he bursts back out into the light, it is alive again. How did this resurrection happen? Now, remember how I said that there is a price to ride the ferry, a coin. Charon will not take you across the ferry without taking a coin. Precious metal, it's precious metal that must be surrendered. What core Mandalorian creed was Din Djarin missing? What part of the spirit of his father was still dead within him? Okay, here's where my theory comes in. Charity, that love that makes us reach out and connect with others who may or may not be of any use to us. Pure, selfless love. As a wise man, a man who knew all about the old stories that this show references, these core tenets of a culture, once said, "Now these three abide, faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest of these is charity." Let's look at the three most recent entries into the Star Wars franchise. Rebels was about faith. Kanan and Ezra having faith in each other and the institutions that they were helping to rebuild. As a worthy successor to the animated Clone Wars that gave us, the fans, faith that the writers of this new Star Wars could continuously produce something good. Rogue One was very, very literally, very, very obviously about hope. Hope in the Star Wars universe, and hope that the fans could love Disney content without picking each other to death over it. Now we have The Mandalorian. The Mandalorian is about charity, and by the muses if it isn't the greatest of those three examples. So, Din Djarin, he lacked charity, the kind of selfless love that led a Mandalorian to reach his hand out to a terrified child. Yes, he had rescued Baby Yoda, defied the world for him. But when the armorer told him the history of the sorceress, he again instantly identified the child as an enemy, just as he did before he rescued the child from the Imperial safe house. This is Din Djarin acting as someone who's bound entirely by the way, or rather how he interpreted the way. He is following the law, following the creed exactly to the letter, without truly giving his love fully to the child. He took the child because that is what a Mandalorian is supposed to do, but he wasn't able to really connect to the child with charity. But there, on the flaming River Styx, in the presence of the fairy droid Charon, Din Djarin lets that uncharitable part of himself die. Somewhere in the darkness, he begins to give charity, love, not to the child, not to the one who it would be easiest to give love to, but to IG-11, to the one whom he hated. That part of his father's creed was dead within him, was now alive again. Because Mandalorians canonically have adopted many children who were children of the enemies. You have to be able to show this love to anyone if the situation calls for it. And so here we have Din Djarin opening up his heart and expressing sadness. Why does he express sadness? Remember, the fairy droid. The fairy droid is Charon, and he is inevitable. He is carrying you over the river of death. And even though Cara Dune blew off his head, even though they resisted, the inevitable must occur. The ferryman must have his price. You must surrender the coin, the precious metal. And this is why, in the sense of this story, for the mythology of the story to be complete, IG-11 had to die. The precious metal was given, the toll was paid. And then Din Djarin's father came out of the world, the underworld, into the light of the living again. There was a full clan in that ferry, all that was necessary to maintain the life of the Mandalorian culture. Even if it was only a clan of two, there was a Mandalorian who had never left the way, with his foundling at his side, and the inheritance of the mythosaur already passed down to the foundling. Cara Dune and Greef Karga also have this moment in their own bit. With the Empire gone, they can both, in a way, return to the cultures that bothered them. We do not know much about Greef other than that he was a magistrate, which implies an ordered civilization, and he was one who maintained that order. But his fallen. He's died. He's become a bounty hunter. He is something that barely works for order, and it leaves a trail of chaos in his wake. And Cara Dune was of Alderaan. Alderaan represented by Bail Organa, that bastion of civilization, order, kindness, and mercy. He would probably be a good representation of her cultural father. Before that ferry ride, she was an outlaw, and Grief was a mere organizer of bounty hunters. From what they said, they were both returning to their cultural roots of maintaining a nice, orderly culture there on Navarro, recreating just a little bit of Alderaan and whatever culture Grief was a magistrate of. So they both have a much smaller moment. But this moment, this was about Din Djarin and his cultural father. It was Din Djarin and his son, his foundling. We hope that there are other Mandalorians out there. We hope that some of them escaped that little purge on Navarro. We hope that there might be other coverts. But it doesn't matter. Mandalore is alive in the cockpit of the Razor Crest. So, what do you think, my wonderful viewers? Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I reading way too much into this? Leave a like if you agree, and leave a paragraphs-long comment below if you want to tear apart my ideas at the molecular level. Peace out, my wonderful viewers.